Bonjour, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. Je m'appelle Guillaume Saint-Pierre, je vais être votre modérateur. So with us today, Minister of Labour Seamus O'Regan, with Senator Hassan Yussuff and MP Alexandre Boulerice from the NDP. We will start with remarks from Minister O'Regan and Senator Yussuff, I believe, and then we will take questions. We will have until 12:05.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
Thank you all for being here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, and I want to thank my friend Senator Hassan Yussuff for being here today, and for the NDP critic, my NDP critic, Alexandre Boulerice. I want to thank Senator Yussuff. We're going to be talking about strengthening Canada's labour movement and some important progress on an item in our government's confidence and supply agreement with the NDP, which is why I'm thankful that Mr. Boulerice is here as well. Les familles canadiennes traversent une crise d'abordabilité. L'invasion de l'Ukraine par Vladimir Poutine a fait grimper le prix des engrais, de carburant et des céréales, ce qui fait grimper le prix de tout. On va pas laisser ce coup tomber sur le droit de famille qui travaille. On appuie les Canadiens par une aide financière directe et en réduisant les coûts des produits de base, comme le loyer, les garderies et les soins dentaires. Nous veillons également à ce que le processus de négociation collective soit aussi libre et équitable que possible pour que les travailleurs soient en mesure de demander davantage quand ils ont besoin. Canadian families are working through an affordability crisis, as we all know. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has inflated the price of fertilizer, fuel, and grain, which sends up the price of everything. We are not going to let those costs rest on the back of working families. We're supporting people with direct financial support and by bringing down the costs of fundamentals like rent, childcare, and dental care. And we're making sure that the collective bargaining process is as free and fair as it can be. So workers are equipped to ask for more when they feel they should have more for the work that they do. Talking about Canada's labour movement, I think about how different this country was 150 years ago. In a Canada that was much smaller than it is today, we needed coal, we needed steel, we needed iron, we needed rail, we needed homes and hospitals and bridges and post offices. And workers were there. But no one was there for workers. Workers had no rights. Unions were illegal. Organizing was illegal. Demanding better was illegal. I'm thinking of the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919 that injured 30 Canadians, killing 2. I'm thinking of the Toronto Printers' Strike in 1872 that led to the arrest of the entire strike committee. That was when there was no right to strike. It was illegal. Now I'm thinking of how ugly it got when working people asserted their legal right to strike and replacement workers were brought in. I remember when Newfoundland and Labrador postal workers went on strike in 1986. And replacement workers were brought in by the busloads. Hundreds of screaming, angry picketers shaking these buses filled with terrified men and women. I'm thinking of the 18-month-long labor dispute at Giant Mine in Yellowknife in 1992, which had pitted friends and neighbors against each other. 9 men were murdered on September 18th of that year when they triggered a bomb that was set for them at the mine. Workers pitted against each other by the need to feed their families. And instead of being at the negotiating table, the parties were accusing each other of being killers. It pits workers against each other. It's undignified, and it's dangerous. So we are banning replacement workers in strikes and lockouts. To protect that right, to keep parties at the negotiating table. Because the best deals are made at the negotiating table. This is the latest evolution in labor policy in Canada to protect the collective rights, the collective bargaining process. And our federal mediators are there for unions and businesses at those tables. This year alone, they helped parties reach a fair deal without a work stoppage in 90% of negotiations. WestJet, Via, Purolator, Loomis, Bell, Radio-Canada. Today, I'm opening tripartite consultations with employers and unions on a replacement worker ban, on the best way to respect workers' interests and employers' interests. Aujourd'hui, j'ouvre des consultations tripartites avec les employeurs et les syndicats sur notre interdiction des travailleurs de remplacement. C'est la meilleure façon de respecter les intérêts des travailleurs et les intérêts des employeurs. We are also launching a second set of consultations on how workplaces maintain services during a work stoppage. Right now, the process for workers and employers to reach a deal on maintaining services can disrupt the collective bargaining process for huge lengths of time. We need workers and employers to be able to stay at the bargaining table and preserve the right to strike and lockout. We're consulting on how to make the process more efficient and make sure that Canadians' health and safety is protected. But I want to be clear on something. We will not change the threshold or criteria for maintenance of activities. The best deals are made at the negotiating table, and that is where we want the parties' attention. This government will always protect free and fair collective bargaining because collective bargaining is about good jobs. It's about safe work. It's about earning more when it's time to earn more and getting rest when it's time to rest. It's about what workers deserve in return for their labor and how employers can profit from a healthy and happy workforce. It's about certainty. It's about stability and predictability for business. And with the climbing cost of living, the right of workers to bargain for better wages is now more important than ever. Thank you, and I will now hand it over to Senator Yussuff for a few words.
Thank you, Minister, and it is an honor to join you here this morning, of course, in regard to the announcement by the government today, and that is moving forward on a commitment that was made in the last election in their platform. The labor movement for my previous life, before I became a senator, I spent many decades campaigning, of course, for government to bring in legislation that would ban replacement workers. Because we've seen too often when the absence of legislation not there, what happens on a picket line in a process that should really respect collective bargaining. What's not known in this country for the most part is about 99% of collective agreement is solved without no disputes in this country, whether it's at the national level or at the provincial level. It's a small percentage of agreements, of course, where the parties do break down in regard to their deliberations, and that's where they require support. And in our country, of course, we've already had jurisdiction that brought in the ban on replacement workers. In Quebec, we've had a ban on replacement workers now since the 1970s under the René Lévesque government, and successive government of different political stripes has been elected, have not tampered that legislation, they've maintained it. And the piece that, of course, that's been brought about that legislation still remain in Quebec. In British Columbia, we've had, of course, a ban on replacement workers, and that legislation is still on the books, again, in spite of change in government over time. I think what the government is embarking on today with the consultation the minister's outline is to allow the parties to, of course, provide their perspective for the government, of course, to understand where they're coming from, what they would like to see in the legislation, and, of course, for the government to draft the legislation to, of course, to respect this. The Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that the right to strike in this country is a fundamental right protected by our Constitution. I think the decision by the minister and the government today, of course, to bring in legislation that would ban replacement workers shows a commitment, a deep understanding of what the Supreme Court have ruled. Because in absence of actually bringing in a ban on replacement workers, and based on the Supreme Court ruling, we're not furthering, of course, this fundamental right that workers are entitled to have in this country. I believe the federal sector is probably one of the most mature sector in this country in collective bargaining. And of course, the minister and his staff who works in the conciliation and mediation service are some of the best our country have got in terms of allowing the parties, of course, to work with them to reach an agreement. As the minister clearly states, some 80-something agreements have been settled this year with the help of that staff in that department. And that's what we need to rely on more in how we can solve collective agreement in this country. So I would conclude to simply say I applaud the minister for his leadership. For all of my life that I've worked in the labor movement and being the former president of the Labor Congress, I can tell you today is an important day in the process. The minister have not yet outlined the legislation. We'll see that in some near future, but I'm hoping the consultation process will be a vigorous one, which both sides, both employer and of course unions will participate as vigorously and of course will give the government feedback. The last point I would make has to do with the minister consultation. Look, of the maintenance of activity, of course, agreement that needs to be established. As we all know, regardless of where a dispute is taking place in the federal jurisdiction, there is a requirement for the parties to reach an agreement. The legislation provides very clear understanding what needs to happen. And of course, the minister is saying, we need to understand how is the process working, what can we do to improve that process, more importantly, how can we help the parties, of course, ensure that process actually happen in a timely manner, so they can utilize their right under the legislation when they will give notice for a lockout or to exercise their right to strike. Unions, of course, spend their entire life trying to reach collective agreement, not to pick a date so they can end up on a strike. The objective is to reach a collective agreement. I could say without any hesitation, as there will be some noise and they will come loud and clear about whether the government is tipping the balance here in regard to how employers and unions operate in this country. I think what the government is trying to do is to ensure we respect the right of workers, of course, to go on strike, but fundamentally, we're going to want to make sure that those disputes end in a way that are going to ensure there is a collective agreement and, of course, the parties can maintain their relationship when the dispute is over. What we don't know, of course, in the process of collective bargaining is that disputes will happen from time to time. I guess it's like a bit of a marriage. Not all marriages are perfect. The reality is what we do understand in the collective bargaining arena, that the parties spend a great deal of time, of course, trying to preserve the harmony to make sure their workforce, of course, are equipped with the knowledge and the skills to ensure they can make the products and deliver the goods on behalf of the employer. Unions want to make sure that continues to happen, but equally they want to make sure they can negotiate a fair agreement for their members and ensuring that that fair agreement is negotiated is respecting the right, should they have to use it, that workers are not crossing the picket line and creating violence and disputes in the community. So thank you so much. And Minister, I want to commend you for your leadership on this today.
Okay, so we will now go to questions. We will start in the room, and then if we have time, we will go virtually. People that are connected on Zoom can use the raise hand function. Christian Noël, Radio-Canada.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur O'Regan. Bonjour, Monsieur Yusuf, Monsieur Boulerice. In 2016, the NDP had an anti-scab law as a PMB. The Liberals voted against it. So why was it bad then and now it's good? What changed since?
The labor market, substantively. The labor market's changed. You know, you pick it up anecdotally, I'm sure you have. I have, obviously, as an occupational hazard, but there are a lot more jobs now than there are people. And it has changed things. I think it's changed things quite fundamentally. I think we're all still kind of grappling with it, to be honest with you. I think it changes how we will look at the economy. I mean, by all accounts, we will probably be experiencing a downturn in the economy, according to anybody you speak with. I think workers will be shielded from whatever that may be a lot more than they would have been in times previous. They'll feel the brunt, as always, but not nearly as bad, because just unemployment numbers are at historic lows and employment numbers are at historic highs. And that is not what I expected coming out of COVID. So, you know, within that, protecting the collective bargaining process, I think, is really, it's important. I think that we have spent, even since that time, and regardless of COVID, I think we have spent a lot of time with Senator Yussuff in his previous role and with other labor leaders, and I think have a much clearer understanding of how important this is, and that this is an evolution of the collective bargaining process. I think, you know, to commend my colleague, Monsieur Boulerice, I mean, he has been working on this for quite some time. as have other people in the NDP, and I commend them for it. So we're all now on the road to Damascus. There's nothing more irritating than the newly converted, what can I tell you? But I think that this is really important, and I think it can lead to greater stability. But, I'm not going to preempt the consultation process. I am actually one of these people who takes consultations very seriously, and am willing to live with whatever comes from them, and that will direct our legislation.
Before I ask my second question, would Mr. Boulerice like to comment on that particular question? Sur ça, qu'est-ce qui a changé?
Historiquement, le NPD a toujours été là pour défendre les droits des travailleurs et des travailleuses. Pour nous, avoir une loi fédérale qui empêche les travailleurs de remplacement lors d'un conflit de travail a toujours été une priorité. Et c'est pour ça qu'on l'a mis dans l'entente qu'on a négociée avec le gouvernement libéral. Ça fait partie des 27 propositions qui sont sur la table parce que c'est une priorité pour le mouvement syndical et pour les néo-démocrates. Et aujourd'hui, c'est une journée historique. Et je suis extrêmement heureux et fier d'être ici parce que c'est le premier pas vers l'accomplissement et la réalisation d'un projet de loi qui va amener de l'équilibre sur la scène fédérale lors des conflits de travail, puis davantage de respect des droits des travailleurs et des travailleuses, de pouvoir mettre de la pression sur l'employeur pour améliorer leurs conditions de travail. Alors, je remercie énormément le ministre du Travail, M. O'Regan, de cette étape-là qui est importante, du fait que je puisse être présent ici aujourd'hui. Je pense que c'est une journée qui est cruciale, qui est historique pour l'ensemble du mouvement syndical des travailleurs et des travailleuses.
And for my follow-up, Minister O'Regan, you mentioned the labor market is changing. Labor shortages are a huge issue. This seems like it's part of the solution you want to bring forward to help with that. What other things can the government is working on right now to ease the labor shortage in Canada?
First of all, I think on this one, it just gives workers the assurance that they will continue to go to a workplace in which they're safe. I brought up the example of I think it was 1986, the Canada Post strike in Newfoundland. I remember that very well, and I remember the instability and the violence. In Newfoundland, you don't see that sort of unrest. In my city when I was growing up at St. John's. I mean, it was really quite something, and it was vicious, and tempers were high, and it affected, you had more postal workers back then. So, you had more people in your community who were irate about this sort of stuff. And, I think that we can, one thing that I have learned in my time as labor minister, I've worked with some exemplary public servants in the positions that I've held, but I have to say that the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, Peter Simpson and his crew, are outstanding, and they have gotten us through after, CP, that was my baptism, and then after that, we knew we had quite a few, whether it was CN, Via, Purolite or Loomis, WestJet, we had a roster, and Peter keeps them at the table, has an incredible amount of trust, is trusted by both parties, but as well, they are seen as impartial. And they know the dynamics of that table. And when it works, we saved billions for Canadians, I think. Not just the federal civil servants involved, but the union leadership involved and the employers involved, I think, for all their own reasons, came to agreements on some major files that would have affected supply chains in this country at the last, at the time we needed it the least as we attempt to recover from COVID. So, I'm deeply grateful. And when they say, look, the table is the table, and that's where you want to get the deals done. Those are the most resilient deals. Anything that we can do to keep people at that table, the better.
Campbell Clark, Globe and Mail.
Mr. O'Regan, we heard the Senator Yussuff say that there'll be opposition, lots of noise.
Yeah.
I think economists would say unemployment is low, employment is high, inflation is high. So the costs of labor going up would contribute to inflation. And there's already a tight labor market. So is this the right time for this?
Well, I'm not necessarily, I don't know if the math necessarily adds up, whether replacement workers would affect the equation. What we're doing here is making sure that workers and companies stay at the table and that their attention is at the table. This is a time when you're searching for stability. You want to make sure that, I think the good fortune, well, it wasn't good fortune, but the good work that was done over the summer continues. And I think that, you know, when you have tripartite negotiations and all three are at the table in determining how this legislation should look, that will be helpful. And remember too, you know, there's a second track here, Campbell, that's on maintenance of activities. So, you know, basically coming to an agreement in different workplaces about, you know, how do you make sure that there are certain activities that affect the economy and Canadians? How do we ensure that they continue while workers stay at the table?
Has the business community been telling you this will be bad for the economy?
No, but it's going to be a change. And look, I'm not going to, you know, I think that this is, I don't think they're entirely happy about it. I think that's fair to say. But I think that, you know, as we sit down and we work this through, I think that we can come to common cause on this. I really do believe it's important. I really do believe that this is the natural evolution of workers' rights in this country. Again, while I'm not going to downplay the significance of where the economy may go in the next couple of years, I do know that just pure demographics dictate that workers right now are empowered, no question about it. And if anything, we need to make sure that the workers that we do have are in the positions where they are most needed in order to keep the economy going. Empowering them, I don't think is a bad thing at the moment at all.
David Thurton, CBC.
Hi, thanks. I guess I just want to ask Mr. Boulerice this question.
Switching.
I guess what's the point of moving forward with this legislation if you have a Liberal government and even a Conservative government who is so willing to, you know, bring through back-to-work legislation in the Parliament? How is this protecting workers' rights if you have governments like that? Are you going to be pushing for, you know, more action on that side of things?
I cannot presume what will be the result of next federal elections. And but right now, what I know is that, you know, we want to bring more balance in relations between employers and employees at the federal level, and you know, to have a legislation that will ban replacement workers will be good for everybody. It's more stability. The conflicts are not too long. They are in fact shorter, and there's no less risk of violence, and the protection of the rights of workers is there. So it's a really important step what the minister is announcing today, and really proud that the NDP, we put that in the agreement that we negotiated with the Liberal government. It's the step forward for the rights of the workers. It's a good thing for the future. I think it's a good thing for the economy in general. And I'm asking everybody who is interested to participate in those really important consultations, and we will see, you know, a bill as soon as possible in one day, and really happy to see that. And, you know, about what the future will put ourselves in a situation with the result of elections, I'll let the voters decide that, okay?
Okay.
David, I may also say very briefly, I think that the point you raised is a very important one, but I think with legislation coming forward after the consultation that would bring in a ban on replacement workers would mean that bringing in legislation to override that principle will be the end of it. In other words, legislating workers back to work, this will be something of the past, not of the future. Because you can't square the two things. You can't have a ban on replacement workers, then override the law by passing another piece of legislation to take away that right. I think it would be a fundamentally affront to the whole principle of bringing in legislation to ban replacement workers. And of course, I think what it will show over time that you will allow the parties to mature their relationship. Collective bargaining is not supposed to be easy and comfortable. It's a tough part of the world we live in. But both parties understand that. They're very well prepared for it, and they're committed to that process. And it works every day. When I said to you, 99% of collective agreements in this country are settled without dispute, that's the reality. When it does go off the rail, we need to find the tools we have at the federal level, but also at the provincial level, which is mediation and conciliation service to help the parties figure that out and get back to the table to reach a collective agreement. So I think this will complement, I think to a large extent, what the parties can do best is to negotiate a collective. And the best collective agreements are the one the parties negotiate, not imposed by an arbitrator or by a government at the end of the day.
I'm just going to follow up on that too. When I mentioned that this is a natural evolution too, I mean, I think it's important to remember that January 2015 Supreme Court decision that actually codified that the right to strike was protected by the Charter. So that's important. Two things on a political level. One, on back-to-work legislation. I can't tell you the amount of pressure that I was under in the incessant questions that I received from media and from all sorts of people on CP rail and bringing back-to-work legislation. And I was absolutely adamant that we wouldn't do it because I believe in the table. Secondly, do not group, I mean, it's me, but don't group the Liberals together with the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre when it comes to workers' rights. I mean, the guy, you know, actively worked on two pieces of legislation. One thing to be neglectful, it's quite another thing to work on two pieces of legislation that would have tipped the balance by demanding that unions disclose their finances at the negotiating table and make it harder for new unions to certify. It was completely anti-union. Now, I don't want to, that's just for the record. I'm actually hopeful that the Conservatives in their conversion to workers' rights will back us on this legislation when it comes around. And, you know, I worked with them on paid sick leave, and we were able to do that with unanimous consent of the House. So, you know, let's call it. Let's see if they're willing to come to the table. I would welcome it. I've welcomed it before, and I'll welcome it again. But for the record, I mean, you know, those are two pieces of legislation we immediately scrapped when we got in there. They were aggressively anti-union.
And Minister, you seem to be not optimistic about the future of the Canadian economy. What tells you that we're heading into tough times?
Well, I think, you know, anybody who knows a lot more than me, and there's a lot more people in the, you know, in economics and finance who are saying that, you know, just the way things are going with inflation numbers, although those inflation numbers today weren't as bad as we thought they would be. In the United States, they're higher than we thought. In the UK, obviously, you know, they're having a heck of a time. Those will have ripple effects here. I think what buttresses this somewhat is, you know, I'm a big believer that the best social program and sometimes the best economic program is a job. And jobs are holding in this country. And I think that they will see us through tough times. But we got to make sure that we're there for workers, and we got to make sure that we're optimizing our labor pool. And we've got to increase it. But, you know, for years and years and years, we knew, just looking at numbers and demographics, we knew that baby boomers would retire, and we knew that they were having fewer children as Gen Xers were. And that's happened now. And it's accelerated because of COVID, because enough people took early retirement, and because when we look to retail and hospitality and tourism as they opened, we just didn't have the teens and 20-somethings that we once had to flood that market with labor. And, you know, when people would say to me, well, we're all the workers, you know, people who are working business, you know, you try and come up with a polite answer, and sometimes it's because they may be working for your competition, because they're getting better pay, because they're getting better work-life balance, or they may have moved, in often cases, to a different industry. I fly a lot, and when I was in university, my summer job was working as a ground crew, bags and freight. And I can tell you, even though we complain about flights not landing on time, sometimes they do. In fact, often they do. It's just that you don't actually get to the gate for another hour and a half. It's not enough ground crew. That's a tough job. They don't get paid as much money as they should. And they were let go very quickly. So I don't know whether they're working in Amazon warehouses or where they're working now, but they found something better. And that is the market that we are living in. Workers will demand more, and they will work in places where they get more.
Stéphanie Levitz, Toronto Star.
Minister, I wonder, you noted their back-to-work legislation, and I wonder if you could provide sort of more recent examples of where this legislation, this idea, would help forestall problems that we've seen recently in the market. If we had this bill right now, do you have an example of some recent dispute where this would have had an effect, just to sort of explain to people why this is useful?
And we had to use back-to-work legislation in Port of Montreal, which is, I mean, anyway, it's another kettle of fish, as we say in Newfoundland. I'll leave that one be. maybe, Hassan, I'll ask you in a second, maybe you have some examples, but I think, I think that I don't want to preclude the consultation process, and I don't want to say anything that would, again, would preclude it, but I think you empower the table when you do this. Like you have to get things done at the table. I do know, just as as a spectator, that replacement workers, as they're often called, scabs, can become a massive distraction from the energies of the people who need to have their focus on the table. I've become a big believer of the table. I don't know, did you want to expand on that? Did you want to?
It's hard to presume, how things would have evolved if this. I know if we had a ban on replacement workers in many of the disputes where government have intervened, the parties will simply know, hey, we don't have an option. We have to bargain to find a resolve here. And it's best for us to do that because we also need to know what are the outcome of our negotiations and how we're going to maintain the harmony and ensure this workplace will continue to focus on things we do best, whether it's on the ports or whether it's in a typical workplace where they're making stuff that requires workers to focus on that at the end of the day. Too often when the relations become fractured because of a dispute and because of replacement workers crossing the picket line, first of all, the harmony in the workplace is completely disrupted. It takes years to rebuild in many cases. Workers don't talk to each other. And then, of course, the employers have figured out, oh, we still got a business to run. Well, things don't go back to normal overnight just because you decided you've reached a collective agreement with all of the disruptions that have happened. So I think what this will show, and time will tell, that as we have seen in Quebec with the legislation, governments have recognized, hey, this brings a sense of security about how we are going to run labor relationships in our province. You want to invest in a province, this is part of the norm. This will be the part of the norm at the federal level. And the federal level, I have to say, both on the employer side and on the union side, they're very mature. But once in a while, you will have a dispute. It's not the end of the world to have a dispute. But if you do, make sure the conditions that will come out of that disputes are going to ensure that that workplace will maintain its harmony at the end of the day. That's what you want to do. And if the government needs to put more resources, mediation and conciliation service, so be it. If they need to beef up the CIRB, which is the arm from the government that deals with the issues that goes before them, so be it. Because all of these institutions are there to help the parties achieve the greater objective. How can you reach a collective agreement? What can we do to assist you? So I think you will see greater unity. I think a colleague from the Globe and Mail asked the questions. Even in spite of inflation, union wage demand have not outstripped inflation numbers in the country. As a matter of fact, they're running below inflation. So there's maturity recognizing that inflation is going to be temporary and we need to recognize we need to be compensated. But at the same time, people are being responsible, recognizing that we don't want to fuel the crisis. We want to make sure that we get a fair deal for our members at the end of the day.
Yeah. Maybe it's not a recent example, but 20 years ago, I was hired by Canadian Union of Public Employees, and 2 weeks after, there was a conflict at Videotron. And it took almost a year to resolve that conflict. And it was longer and harder and tougher because there was replacement workers. It could have been resolved much more faster without that. So I had this personal experience that, and after that, I've worked those last 20 years to try to fix that problem, and so today it's a good day. Oui. Donc, il y a 20 ans, j'ai été engagé par le syndicat canadien de la fonction publique. 2 semaines plus tard, il y avait le début du conflit de travail à Vidéotron. Ça a pris pratiquement 1 an avant de trouver une entente. Ce conflit-là aurait pu être écourté, aurait pu durer moins longtemps, avoir moins de tensions si on avait eu une législation comme celle qu'on veut avoir, qui empêche les travailleurs de remplacement. Ça a été long, ça a été tendu, ça a été dur parce qu'il y avait des travailleurs de remplacement. Alors, c'est ce problème-là qu'on essaie de régler aujourd'hui.
Just as a follow-up, as you noted off the top, Minister, that this is a condition, for lack of a better term, of the supply and confidence arrangement between your party and the NDP. A bigger part of that deal is just transition. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we could hear from you about where that is and what's happening with that and when can we expect to see some more movement?
And Mr. Boulerice and I talk about it quite frequently, and I don't know, it may not necessarily be indicative in the question period, but we talk quite frequently with all our NDP colleagues about this. I think we'll see something, very soon. But I've been adamant about something, and I keep hearing you have to work, you have to listen to the unions, you have to listen, they have to have a seat at the table. They will lead it. They will lead it. There's nobody who has a greater understanding of what we need to do in the energy industry in this country than the workers who are the front lines of it. It's that simple. So they'll lead it. We'll just have to figure out, the resources and some inner workings of government departments and blah, 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 and all that stuff. But there's a great want and desire to do this because it's the right thing to do. First and foremost, I just want to give people peace of mind. There is absolutely no way that I see some massive disruption and layoffs of people in the energy industry in this country. We have massive upgrades to do to our grids. We are serious about carbon capture, and I'm frankly getting very tired of this being written off as some sort of experimental technology. When Senator Yussuff and I were just over in Stavanger, and a press conference was being held by Shell, Equinor, about a massive multi-billion-dollar carbon capture project that's happening off the shores of Norway. They've been at it for some 25 years. This is happening. There are issues with carbon capture utilization that I think we have to get somewhere with. It's not perfect, but carbon capture and its storage is been proven in many parts of the world, and it is going to be essential. It's going to be essential not only for sequestration of carbon, but it's also going to be essential as we develop a hydrogen industry. Because if we can use natural gas and sequester the carbon, we are going to have incredibly reasonably priced hydrogen, I believe, coming out of Saskatchewan and Alberta. They're like game changer stuff. We know this. We need people to do it. We need people to lower the emissions and build up renewables. I don't like saying just transition. I've repeated it because workers keep telling me they hate the phrase. I know he likes the phrase, and it did come from the trade union movement. I acknowledge, but there are a lot of people. It's become such a polarizing phrase, and I just want to get people beyond it. Right now, that what we're talking about here is a huge endeavor. I would argue probably one of the biggest endeavors is that this country, as the fourth biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, is probably the biggest that we've ever confronted. But we are perfectly capable of dealing with it. The expertise of people on the front lines is incredible. We asked, I keep repeating this, 2 generations ago, we asked workers out west to figure out how to get oil and gas out of sand. We were the 4th biggest producers of oil and gas in the world, generation and a half, arguably. And I was there when we were writing, I wrote speeches for Brian Tobin when he was Premier of Newfoundland, when there was first oil for Hibernia, and we didn't know what the heck we were doing. And now all our people are flying all over the world, showing other jurisdictions how to do it. The president of ExxonMobil Canada told me there's no harsher environment that they operate in the world. We are capable of dealing with this, and we are capable of showing the world how to do it. I am utterly convinced in my 2 years during COVID of being Natural Resources Minister of the challenges that we can overcome in our energy industry.
C'est tout le temps qu'on avait pour les questions. Thank you, everyone. That's all the time that we have.
Thank you all.